When my wife recounted everything to me, it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. The idea that my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, someone we trusted and saw as family, had been harboring these feelings for my wife was incomprehensible. Hearing her voice tremble as she shared every detail of their conversation at lunch made my anger and disbelief grow by the second. I tried to remain composed, but inside I was seething. How could he say such things to her, and at a public cafe no less? The audacity of his words, the promises, the confessions of watching her for years, the delusion that they were somehow destined to be together, made my stomach churn. This was not just a lapse in judgment, this was premeditated. He had clearly rehearsed this in his mind over and over again, and it was deeply unsettling. When my wife told me that he had started texting her immediately after their conversation, I felt a wave of anger I could barely contain. First, he sent apologies, claiming he didn't mean it, that it was just infatuation, and that he regretted making her uncomfortable. But the damage was already done. She had left work early, visibly shaken, and rushed home to talk to me. As she sat down and showed me the continuous stream of messages, her phone buzzed yet again. It was him calling. I told her to answer and put him on speaker. If he had something to say, I wanted to hear it for myself. The moment she picked up, we were greeted by his panicked, tearful voice. He was begging her not to tell my sister, swearing it was all a misunderstanding. He said he had misread her actions, thought she felt the same way, and interpreted her playful banter as flirting. My wife, ever the straightforward one, had to stop herself from shouting back at him. I could see the anger in her eyes as he spun excuse after excuse. Then he made a desperate admission. He claimed that during our last family gathering, when my wife and he had crossed paths in the kitchen, he thought there was some kind of connection. My wife looked at me exasperated and rolled her eyes. He must have completely lost his mind, she whispered to me as he continued rambling. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. Yes, she told me, I said, making sure my voice was firm and unyielding. His sobbing stopped for a moment, replaced by a panicked gasp. You're on speaker, I added, making it clear that his excuses weren't going to work on either of us. Oh. He began pleading with me now, his voice trembling. Please don't tell her. Please don't tell your sister. It was a mistake. I didn't mean it. I'll do anything. Just don't say anything to her. He sounded desperate, as though his entire life was unraveling before him. I didn't respond right away, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done. My wife ended the call abruptly, unable to listen to any more of his ramblings. He's only sorry because he got caught, she said, her voice filled with disgust, and I couldn't have agreed more. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was a betrayal of our entire family. This wasn't just about his feelings, it was about the ripple effect his actions would have on everyone. My sister, their children, our parents, and the tight-knit bond we thought we shared as a family. Everything felt fragile now, like it could fall apart at any moment. We sat in silence for a while, trying to process what had just happened. I knew one thing for certain. This was not something we could brush under the rug or keep hidden. My sister deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it would be, but the thought of shattering her world weighed heavily on both of us. This was just the beginning of what I feared would be a long, painful unraveling of our family. As my brother-in-law crumbled under the weight of his guilt, my sister stood like a pillar of strength. Her words were sharp and unwavering, cutting through his attempts to explain. Pack a bag and go, she repeated, her voice devoid of any emotion. It was as if she had already decided he was no longer a part of her life. My wife and I stood to the side, silent witnesses to the unraveling of their marriage. I wanted to comfort my sister, to say something that could ease her pain, but the moment was hers to handle. My brother-in-law, still sobbing, tried to plead his case, his voice cracking with desperation. It was a mistake, he stammered. I don't know what I was thinking. Please, Sarah, just give me a chance to make it right. But my sister wasn't having any of it. Her expression didn't waver as she pointed toward the door. Stop, she said, her voice slicing through his excuses. There's nothing you can say that will fix this. You betrayed me and you tried to pin it on my sister-in-law. You've destroyed my trust, not just in you but in everything we've built. Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. My brother-in-law hesitated, looking at her as though he couldn't believe what was happening. Then, finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Without another word, he turned and went inside to pack his things. Once he was out of earshot, my sister's composure cracked. She sat down on the porch steps, her head in her hands. Silent tears started to stream down her face, and my wife immediately sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. I knelt in front of her, unsure of what to say. What words could possibly make this moment any better? I'm so sorry, Sarah, I finally managed to say. We should have told you sooner. We didn't want to hurt you, but you deserve to know the truth." She looked up at me, her eyes red and brimming with tears. "I just don't understand," she whispered. "How could he do this to me, to our family?" My wife and I exchanged a glance, both of us struggling to find an answer. "It's not your fault," my wife said softly. "None of this is your fault. He made his choices and they were wrong. You didn't deserve any of this." My sister nodded, her expression one of quiet devastation. "I thought we were happy," she said. "I thought we had a good life. I don't know what to tell the kids." The mention of her children brought a fresh wave of anguish and she started crying harder. My wife wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly as she sobbed. I felt a lump in my throat as I watched them, wishing there was something, anything, I could do to take away her pain. When my brother-in-law reappeared with a small suitcase in hand, he paused in the doorway, his eyes darting between us. He looked utterly defeated, his face pale and drawn. My sister stood up, her tears gone but her resolve still intact. "Leave," she said simply, "and don't come back until I decide what's next." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, but then thought better of it. With one last glance at her, he walked to his car and drove away. The sound of his tires on the gravel faded into the night, leaving only silence in its wake. For a long moment no one said anything, then my sister turned to me and my wife, her face etched with exhaustion. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I know it wasn't easy, but I needed to know." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "We're here for you, Sarah. Whatever you need, we're here." As we left her house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. My sister's family was shattered and the trust we all shared as a close-knit group had been irreparably damaged. But one thing was clear, my sister was strong, stronger than I had ever realized, and I knew she would find a way to rebuild her life, piece by piece. Thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more real-life stories like this one. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. She turns away from him, trembling with rage, and walks back to where my wife is sitting. My sister pulls her into a hug, a moment of solidarity in the face of betrayal. It's heartbreaking and relieving at the same time. Heartbreaking because of the pain this has caused, but relieving to see the bond between them holding firm despite everything. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law stands frozen, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. He stares at me, as if hoping for some kind of lifeline, but I have none to offer. His pathetic attempt to explain himself earlier only made things worse. His lies, his excuses, they've all crumbled under the weight of the truth. "You need to leave," I say firmly, my voice steady but laced with anger. "Pack your things and get out. You've done enough damage." For a moment he looks like he's going to argue, but then he seems to realize there's nothing left to say. Slowly he turns and walks inside, presumably to gather his belongings. My sister doesn't even glance in his direction. Her focus is entirely on my wife. "I need to understand something," my sister says, her voice trembling but determined. "Why did he think this would work? Did he really believe there was something between you two?" My wife shakes her head, her eyes glistening with tears. "No, there was nothing, I swear. I don't know what made him think there was. Maybe I said or did something he misunderstood, but I never encouraged him. Never." She looks down, as if searching her memory for clues. "The only thing I can think of is, last weekend, at our place, we both reached for the fridge at the same time. It was silly, we laughed, and then he reached past me to grab a beer. It felt off, like he was too close, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make a scene." My sister nods slowly, absorbing my wife's words. "You didn't do anything wrong," she says firmly. "This is on him. He's the one who crossed the line." Their conversation is interrupted when my sister suddenly stands and heads for his laptop sitting on the coffee table. Her movements are swift and deliberate, her face a mask of cold determination. "I want to know what else he's hiding," she says, her voice hard. It doesn't take long for her to find what she's looking for, or rather, what she wasn't prepared to find. Buried in a folder innocuously labeled Work Documents is a collection of photos. Dozens of them, all of my wife. My sister clicks through them, her expression shifting from anger to horror with each image. These are all of you," she whispers, her voice trembling. "And they've been taken over years." My wife moves to look, her face going pale as she sees herself on the screen. Photos taken without her knowledge. There are images from family gatherings, candid moments where she wasn't even looking at the camera. And then there's a set that makes my sister's hand freeze on the trackpad. Pictures from our Caribbean vacation, my wife in a bikini completely unaware that someone was watching. My sister's hands begin to shake as she closes the laptop. She looks at me, then at my wife, her voice barely a whisper. He's been obsessed with you for years. The weight of her words settles over the room like a heavy fog. My wife is trembling now, visibly shaken, while I feel a rage bubbling beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. This isn't just a betrayal, it's a violation. I'm calling the police, my sister says, her voice suddenly steady. He doesn't get to walk away from this, not after everything he's done. Before any of us can respond, my brother-in-law reappears, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He freezes when he sees my sister holding his laptop, her face pale with fury. "What did you find?" he asks, his voice barely audible. "You already know," she spits, her words dripping with venom. "And I'm done with you." The confrontation isn't over, but the path forward is becoming clearer. There's no salvaging this. My sister is determined to take action to protect herself and her kids from the man she thought she knew. And as for me, I know this is just the beginning of unraveling the damage he's caused. As she scrolls through the pictures, it becomes painfully clear that he has been secretly taking these photos for years, obsessively collecting them. The realization sends a shiver down her spine. Does this now enter restraining order territory? She asks, her voice trembling and barely above a whisper. The situation has taken a turn far darker and more disturbing than any of us could have imagined. The line between inappropriate behavior and something deeply insidious has been unmistakably crossed. She calls us over and shows us the images. My wife gasps, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. She's visibly horrified, completely blindsided by the realization that he had been doing this behind her back, nurturing an obsession she had no idea existed. My sister, her anger now mixed with an overwhelming sense of betrayal, starts discussing next steps, legal action, protection for her kids, and the need for a restraining order. These aren't just considerations anymore, they're becoming necessities. We're all reeling from this new discovery. The man we thought we knew, the husband, the father, the brother-in-law we trusted, has revealed a side of himself that's not just inappropriate, but deeply unsettling. What started as a shocking confession of infatuation has spiraled into something far more sinister. Unfortunately, the nightmare is far from over. Last night, my sister decided to confront him directly and demand the full story. Determined to leave no room for lies or half-truths, she invited my wife to join the conversation, ensuring transparency. They set up a FaceTime call, and I stayed off camo, listening in with my heart pounding, torn between anger and dread. Ever meticulous, my sister recorded the entire call as a precaution. The tension was palpable the moment the call began. My brother-in-law appeared utterly broken, his eyes red and swollen from crying. He started hesitantly, his voice shaky and hesitant. But as he spoke, the full extent of his obsession began to spill out, unraveling a story that none of us were prepared for. "It started the day I met her," he confessed, his voice barely audible. He explained that it had all begun at one of those early family gatherings when my sister had excitedly introduced him as her boyfriend. At the time, my wife and I were dating, but he admitted that he had met her before he met me. What began as an innocent crush quickly grew into something he couldn't control. At first, he thought his feelings were purely physical, something fleeting and insignificant. But over time, as he spent more time around her, he found himself drawn not just to her appearance, but to her personality, her laugh, and the way she interacted with everyone around her. He admitted to being captivated by her energy, even in the most mundane moments. He tried to suppress these feelings, convincing himself that they were harmless, but they weren't. Instead, his fixation grew stronger. He began creating excuses to be near her, volunteering to help at family events, and sending trivial texts under the guise of casual conversation. Slowly and insidiously, his obsession spiraled out of control, leading him to the deluded belief that confessing his feelings might somehow lead to reciprocation. My sister listened intently, her face a mask of cold fury and heartbreak. She didn't interrupt, letting him dig his grave deeper with each word. My wife, on the other hand, sat frozen, visibly shaken by the depth and duration of his obsession. Hearing how long this had been going on was almost too much for her to bear. The betrayal felt enormous. When he finally stopped speaking, a heavy silence hung in the air. My sister's voice, icy and sharp, cut through the quiet like a blade. "What made you think that she would ever leave her husband for you?" she demanded, her eyes boring into him. He stammered, searching desperately for an answer. He mumbled about moments he had misinterpreted, gestures he had twisted into signs of mutual attraction. That was the final straw. Both my wife and my sister exploded, their anger and frustration erupting like a dam breaking under pressure. Like a unicorn waking from What followed was a storm of raw, unfiltered emotion. They yelled, they cursed, and they poured out every ounce of pain and betrayal that had been simmering beneath the surface. My wife, shaking and pale, eventually hung up the call, unable to take any more. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady herself, tears brimming in her eyes. She turned to me, her voice cracking as she reassured me. "I swear, it was never anything more than him. I never gave him a reason to think." She trailed off, overcome by emotion. I placed my hand on hers, meeting her gaze. "I know," I said firmly, and I did. I believed her completely. I always had. Even if there had been a fleeting moment of physical attraction at some point, I knew my wife. I knew her values, her commitment to trust and fidelity. This entire ordeal was a product of my brother-in-law's twisted fantasies, a dangerous delusion that had nearly torn our family apart. But now the truth was laid bare. The question remained, what would we do with it? The tension that had been simmering during the call finally erupted into a storm of emotions. My wife's voice was a mix of fury and pain, while my sister's tone was cold and unforgiving. The air was thick with betrayal, disbelief, and anger, making it hard to even breathe. The call ended abruptly when my wife, shaking and overwhelmed, hung up. She turned to me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "It was one-sided," she assured me, her voice trembling. "I never thought it wasn't," I replied gently, trying to calm her. Deep down, I had always known she would never act on any inappropriate feelings, even if she had found him attractive at some point. My wife has always been serious about trust and fidelity, and once those values are broken, there's no going back for her. I couldn't help but reflect on the moment early in our relationship that encapsulated her stance on loyalty. One morning as she was getting dressed, I watched her silently, admiring her without saying a word. She caught me staring, gave me a teasing smile, and asked if I liked what I saw. Then her expression turned serious, her tone cold and unwavering. "Never mess this up," she said firmly, "or you'll never see this again." She meant every word, and I've always admired her integrity. This entire ordeal had shaken her deeply, but it had not and would not compromise the foundation of trust we had built together. Meanwhile, my thoughts turned to my brother-in-law. I always knew he carried himself with a bit of arrogance, walking with that cocky swagger, but I had no idea he thought so highly of himself to believe he could pull off something like this. His delusions of grandeur were staggering, a complete detachment from reality. Later that evening, I spoke with my sister more calmly. The initial shock had worn off, and she was now fully focused on her children and their future. She told me that she planned to contact a lawyer immediately to explore her legal options. Her priority was no longer saving her marriage, but protecting her kids from the fallout of her husband's actions. "As far as I'm concerned, he's detached from reality," she said, her voice steely and resolved. Her concern was entirely for her children. She wanted to shield them from as much of the chaos as possible and maintain a sense of stability in their lives. Despite everything, my brother-in-law returned home yesterday, not because my sister wanted him back, far from it, but because she couldn't legally stop him, yet. Until the legal proceedings moved forward, he had the right to be there. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating, filled with unspoken resentment and tension. Their marriage was over, and I think he finally understood that. His eyes carried a hollow, defeated look, as if he had come to terms with the fact that he had destroyed his own life. Any hope he had of salvaging their relationship was gone. He stayed in the guest room, a shadow of his former self, barely a presence in the house that now felt foreign to him. My sister met with her lawyer, who assured her that the documented evidence of his behavior, the texts, voicemails, and disturbing cache of photos, would greatly strengthen her case for full custody of the kids. Surprisingly, my brother-in-law didn't seem inclined to fight her on it. It was as though he knew he had lost everything and didn't have the energy or will to resist. As for my sister, she is stronger than she looks. Any love she once had for him has been replaced by determination to move forward. She walks through the house with a quiet resolve, her focus entirely on her children and their well-being. She's already spoken to a child psychologist to help them navigate the changes ahead and prepare for the inevitable questions and emotions that will arise. The kids don't know the full details yet, but they sense something is wrong. Children always do. My brother-in-law's absence won't be as jarring for them as one might expect. He was rarely home anyway, often sleeping at the fire station or working double shifts. His presence in their lives had always been inconsistent, a quiet but persistent gap they had grown used to. Still, the loss of stability, of having both parents under the same roof, will be a difficult adjustment. My sister is ready for this challenge. She's prepared to step into the role of both mother and father, providing her kids with the love and support they'll need. Despite everything, she remains resolute and unshaken, focused on creating a better future for her family. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law lingers in the guest room, a silent figure in a house that no longer feels like his home, a man who has reaped the consequences of his actions. He seems resigned to his fate, going through the motions but devoid of any real fight. It's a sad, pitiful sight, but my sympathy is limited. Some friends have speculated that someone as obsessive as my brother-in-law couldn't have fixated on just one person. However, as far as we can tell, his fixation has been solely on my wife, singular, intense, and all-consuming, leaving no room for anyone else. After everything came to light, my wife blocked his phone number, trying to create some distance and protect herself from his unwanted advances. But on the same night he returned home, he sent her an email from an account he had just created. It started with what appeared to be a sincere apology, but it quickly spiraled into something far darker. He began by saying he never got to finish what he wanted to say at the restaurant that day, implying there was more he needed to confess. Then he poured out paragraphs upon paragraphs about all the things he loved about my wife. He described the desperation he felt and the overwhelming emotions that had driven him to act so irrationally. He recounted every little detail he admired about her, her smile, her laugh, the way she interacted with others. It was deeply unsettling to see his obsession laid bare, his thoughts captured in stark, unsettling clarity. Again, he mentioned their supposed mutual attraction, insisting there was a palpable sexual tension between them that he had always felt. It was painfully delusional, his way of twisting her friendly and playful demeanor into something it never was. The email painted a picture of a connection that existed only in his mind, a fantasy he had convinced himself was real. Then the email took another turn, focusing on me. It was full of vitriol and disdain, making it painfully clear how low an opinion he had of me. He was certain I wasn't satisfying my wife, criticizing everything from my appearance to my demeanor. His words were calculated to undermine me, to sow seeds of doubt and insecurity. Reading the email felt like a gut punch. It was clear his obsession had warped his perception of reality, fueling both his unhealthy fixation on my wife and his hatred for me. He saw me as nothing more than an obstacle, someone unworthy of the woman he had placed on a pedestal. But rather than feel threatened, his words only solidified my resolve to protect my wife and my family from his delusions. We forwarded the email to my sister and her lawyer. It was yet another piece of evidence that illustrated his unstable state of mind. The mix of obsession, apology, and vitriol was disturbing, and might just be enough to ensure his removal from the house permanently. For now, my wife and I are taking it one day at a time. The support from our friends and family has been invaluable, helping us navigate this surreal and painful situation. My wife isn't doing great, but she's improving little by little each day. She does feel guilty for being too comfortable around my brother-in-law. Normally, she's very careful about setting boundaries with other men, something that's become second nature given how much attention she receives due to her striking looks. However, she let her guard down around him because he was family. She never imagined he would cross such a line. Fortunately, my wife and my sister remain on good terms. There is no resentment between them, which is a relief. While this ordeal has shaken all of us, we will be okay. It will just take time. Thank you to everyone who commented and offered their support throughout this ordeal. My primary concern has always been for my sister and her children. The impact of my brother-in-law's actions on their lives is immense, and ensuring their protection and emotional well-being remains our top priority. Children especially need shielding from toxic situations to maintain their sense of security and normalcy. When faced with such challenges, it's crucial to act quickly and decisively. We didn't hesitate to gather evidence, confront the issue, and involve legal help to protect everyone involved. Delays or denial could have caused even more harm. What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to Vibe Tales for more compelling stories like this.